In the suffocating darkness of a spring dawn in 1623, a scream tore through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace. It wasn't a soldier's death cry or a prisoner's plea. It was Princess Fatma, just 15 years old, daughter of the world's most powerful sultan, screaming with a terror that made even battle-hardened guards retreat in horror. What happened behind those gilded doors that night wasn't love. It wasn't ceremony. It was a ritual so disturbing that the Ottoman Empire buried it for 6 centuries. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The hidden price every sultan's daughter paid. A tradition that destroyed minds before it ever touched bodies. What you're about to discover comes from encrypted documents unearthed in Istanbul's restricted archives in 2019. Verified by Ottoman historians at Boğaziçi University, and censored from every official chronicle for over 600 years until now. The Ottoman Empire stretched like a vast shadow across 3 continents for over 6 centuries from 1299 to 1922. It commanded armies that shook the gates of Vienna and burned across the Arabian deserts. When Constantinople fell in 1453, it became Istanbul, the beating heart of a power that bent kingdoms to its will. At the center of this empire stood Topkapi Palace, a labyrinth of marble courtyards and secret chambers where the fates of nations were sealed with whispers. And deep within those walls lived the imperial harem, a world unto itself where over 800 women existed in a hierarchy of silk and shadows. From 1530 onward, when Sultan Sultan the Magnificent elevated his wife Harem to the title of Haski Sultan, the harem transformed from a place of mere pleasure into a battlefield of political intrigue. Most of its inhabitants were young women, Christian slaves captured from Europe or purchased in North African markets, who entered the training program called the Carrier. Dreaming of catching the Sultan's eye, they learned music, poetry, embroidery, and above all the art of absolute obedience. Some rose to astonishing power during the era known as the Sultanate of Women from 1533 to 1656, when figures like Qasim Sultan and Tiran Hatisha Sultan steered the empire's course from behind screens and lattice windows. But while concubines could climb to influence, the Sultan's own daughters faced a cruel fate. They were currency in the empire's political transactions, human collateral used to purchase loyalty, seal alliances, and bind powerful commanders to the throne. They had no choice in their destiny. From birth, their futures were written in invisible ink, marriage to whomever served the empire's needs best. Into this world, Princess Fatma Sultan was born in 6006, daughter of Sultan Ahmed Darar and the formidable Qasim Sultan, a woman who would rule from the shadows for decades. Fatma was extraordinary even by palace standards. By age 10, she spoke 4 languages fluently: Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Greek. She mastered calligraphy with such elegance that court poets praised her hand as moonlight made visible. Palace astronomers marveled at her questions about celestial mechanics and the movements of stars. She devoured manuscripts on history, philosophy, and geography with a hunger that her tutors found both delightful and unsettling. She was beautiful, yes. Chroniclers described her as having eyes like deep wells of amber and hair that cascaded like black silk. But it was her mind that truly shone. Fatma dreamed not of jewels or titles, but of understanding the universe, of contributing something meaningful to the world of knowledge that surrounded her. She kept journals filled with observations about lunar phases and sketches of architectural marvels she hoped one day to design. But none of this brilliance would protect her. At age 14, her fate was decided in a closed council meeting she would never attend. Her future husband was chosen. Mustafa Pasha, a battle-hardened military commander 20 years her senior, scarred by campaigns against Persia and known for his ruthless efficiency, for him this marriage was a ladder to higher command, a reward for loyalty written in human flesh. For Fatma, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would erase the girl who loved stars and replace her with something hollow. Little did anyone know that the preparations for this wedding would break her mind long before the marriage night arrived. 3 months before the ceremony, on a cold December morning in 1622, Fatma was summoned to the harem's innermost chamber. Her mother, Qasim, the most powerful woman in the empire, sat stone-faced as an announcement was made. There would be no discussion, no appeal. The wedding date was set for March 15th, 1623. What began that day was a process unlike any other culture practiced at the time. The Ottomans called it Terbiyat-e-Mubarak, the sacred education. To the outside world, it sounded like etiquette, training behind closed doors. It was systematic psychological destruction designed to transform royal daughters into instruments of absolute submission. Gulnar Hatun, a severe 60-year old matron who had overseen the preparation of 17 princesses before Fatma, took charge of the process. She was a woman whose face seemed carved from granite, whose voice never rose above a measured monotone, and whose eyes registered no emotion whatsoever. Under her supervision, Fatma was led into the Galen Odessa, the bride's chamber, a room paneled in dark ebony with Persian carpets so thick they muffled every footstep. The windows were covered. The only light came from oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls, adorned with tapestries depicting obedient wives from Islamic history. From dawn until noon each day, Fatma was forced to practice what they called the 18 postures of humility. These were not simple bows. Each one was a choreographed gesture with precise angles and meanings. The greeting bow, the serving bow, the retiring bow, the submission bow. Her neck had to tilt exactly 30 degrees. Her hands could never rise above her heart. Her steps had to be measured. Small, shuffling, never confident or free. Hour after hour, day after day, she repeated these movements until they became automatic, until her body betrayed her spirit by obeying without thought. But the physical training was only the beginning. They came for her voice next. Fatma's vocabulary was reduced to just 43 permitted words, phrases of gratitude, acceptance, apology, and humble request. Yes, my lord, as you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Thank you for your mercy. Any attempt to speak outside this list resulted in immediate punishment. Forced fasting that left her dizzy and weak, confinement in tiny reflection cells barely large enough to sit in, or public humiliation ceremonies where she was made to confess her disobedience. Before the entire female household, while senior concubines hurled verbal abuse at her. If you're shocked by what you're hearing, hit that like button because the worst is still coming. Twice each week, in what was called the lesson of perspective, Fatma was forced to personally serve her father's favorite concubines. She washed them, combed their hair, dressed them in garments meant for their intimate appointments with the Sultan, and fed them by hand like a servant attending nobility. It was psychological warfare designed to crush the last remnants of her royal identity, forcing her to accept that even women who shared her father's bed had authority over her. Witnesses later wrote that Fatma often broke into uncontrollable sobbing during these sessions, her whole body shaking as she fastened the jewelry of women she had once outranked. But nothing compared to what happened in the underground chambers known as Tal, Imilil, the trials of the first night. In subterranean rooms beneath the harem, exact replicas of marital bedrooms had been constructed. There, under the cold supervision of elderly instructors, Fatma was forced to practice with anatomically detailed mannequins commissioned from Venetian craftsmen who specialized in medical models. She had to rehearse acts no 15-year-old should know her, every reaction recorded in coded registers written in Persian to maintain secrecy. Fear, tears, resistance, any sign of rejection meant more sessions, longer hours, harsher conditioning. The girl who once debated scholars about astronomy was being systematically erased. In her place, they were building an obedient shell, a body trained to respond, a voice trained to submit, a mind trained to surrender. 1 week before the wedding, Fatma was moved to the Jelan Kashku, the bride's pavilion, an isolated structure in the palace gardens where no sound from the outside world could penetrate. This was the final stage, the sealing of her fate. Every aspect of her existence was now controlled with obsessive precision. Her diet was regulated down to the ounce. Pomegranates for fertility, honey for sweetness of temperament, almonds for physical endurance, goat's milk for purity, and exotic spices from Yemen, whose purposes the physicians never fully explained. She bathed twice daily in waters perfumed with valerian root, poppy extract, and orange blossom, substances prepared by alchemists drained in Cordoba and Samarkand. Modern analysis of similar recipes suggests they contained mild sedatives and compounds that induced a dreamlike state of compliance, a chemical surrender that made resistance feel impossible. The walls of her pavilion were draped with silk tapestries, illustrating the stories of ideal wives from Ottoman tradition. Women who sacrificed everything, who obeyed without question, who found joy only in their husband's approval. Venetian mirrors were positioned at strategic angles so that wherever Fatma looked, she saw herself. A constant surveillance by her own eyes. The Sufis had once used this technique called muraqabah as a form of spiritual self-awareness. Here it became a weapon of psychological control, forcing the princess to police even her most private thoughts. Palace physicians monitored her constantly. They noted in their journals that she developed what they called bridal tremors. Her hands shook when she tried to eat. Her breath became shallow and rapid for no apparent reason, and she startled violently at any sudden sound. Today, we would recognize these as classic symptoms of severe anxiety and trauma. Then they were simply considered normal preparation. On the final night before the wedding, Fatma was given a special tea. The recipe, discovered in archives centuries later, contained concentrated poppy milk, crushed mandar root, and a substance historians believe was an early form of what we now call a dissociative drug, something that separates the mind from the body's experience. They wanted her calm. They wanted her compliant. They wanted her present in flesh but absent in spirit. As she drank, her last thought as a free, thinking person was of the stars she would never study again. Then the fog rolled in. March 15th, 1623 dawned bright and cold over Istanbul. The city erupted in celebration. Processions wound through streets perfumed with burning incense. Musicians from Persia and Andalusia competed to be heard over the roar of crowds. In Topkapi's grand halls, mountains of food covered golden platters, whole roasted lambs, towers of fruit, pastries dripping with honey. Janissaries staged martial demonstrations, their swords flashing in choreographed combat that drew gasps and cheers. To the public, it was the glorious union of imperial blood and military power. But in a private chamber, Fatma sat motionless, her face pale as winter stone. Court physicians recorded that her pulse was weak and irregular, her skin cold despite the warmth of braziers, her eyes unfocused, as if looking at something very far away or nothing at all. When the public festivities ended and night claimed the palace, the true ceremony began. Fatma was escorted in a procession of women carrying candles through the darkened gardens to the bridal pavilion, a structure that had stood since the days of Mehmed the Conqueror. It was octagonal, 3 levels high, each floor dedicated to a different phase of the ritual. The first level belonged to purification. For 3 hours, Fatma was bathed in waters that steamed with Damascus rose, jasmine, sandalwood, and Somali amber. The ointments applied to her skin were infused with diluted opium and other substances that left her in what physicians later described as ecstasy of surrender, a state where the body ceased to resist even as the mind screamed silently. The second level was the floor of surrender. Here she was, dressed in her bridal costume, white silk embroidered with gold thread, adorned with pearls from the Persian Gulf, a crown so heavy it forced her head down. But hidden within the beautiful garments were instruments of control, concealed clasps that restricted movement, internal cords that bound her torso, weighted jewelry that acted as shackles, shoes with thick soles designed to prevent running. The gown itself was a prison disguised as splendor. Meanwhile, Harem Mustafa Pasha was receiving his own instructions from senior advisors and military veterans. They taught him methods of intimidation, specific phrases designed to establish dominance, physical techniques of control. He was being prepared not for love, but for conquest, the same kind he'd practiced on battlefields, now applied to a 15-year-old girl. Finally, the ascent to the third level, Zephyr, the Chamber of Consummation. Its walls bore tapestries of military victories, cities sacked, armies crushed, princesses captured. The message was clear. What happened in war would happen here. The bed was fitted with concealed rope systems. Cushions were soaked in sedative oils. Lighting was carefully controlled to create an atmosphere of overwhelming power. The doors closed. The witnesses withdrew to listening posts behind screens. And in that room, stripped of protection, dignity, and even her own will, Fatma faced the moment that 3 months of torture had prepared her for. What happened next was recorded in encrypted medical notes, written in Persian and sealed for centuries. Complete physical and psychological collapse. Her body convulsed with tremors. Her voice, already reduced to whispers, disappeared entirely. Her eyes rolled back as consciousness flickered. The physicians watching through hidden panels recorded it as Shaki-Mut, absolute shock. Kara Mustafa Pasha, trained to break battlefield enemies, initially mistook her state for defiance. He employed the techniques he'd been taught: intimidation, assertion, demonstration of authority. But there was nothing to break. Fatma wasn't resisting. She wasn't even there anymore. Her mind had fled deep into dissociation, a psychological escape where consciousness abandons the body to preserve itself. What the physicians eventually recorded as consummation came only after hours of failed attempts. Their notes, written in clinical detachment, describe internal injuries, repeated loss of consciousness, and what they called Ruhan Chakmasa, the departure of the soul. When dawn broke over Istanbul the next morning, the city celebrated a successful royal wedding. But in that pavilion, a girl had died. Not her body that would linger for 29 more years, but everything that made her Fatma. In the days following the wedding night, even the strictest matrons of the harem became alarmed. Fatma had developed selective mutism. She spoke only in barely audible whispers, and only when directly commanded. Her appetite vanished so completely that she had to be force-fed like an infant. Episodes of inconsolable weeping began without warning and lasted for hours. Her body racked with sobs that produced no sound. Most disturbing were the attacks of what chroniclers called fear sickness. The presence of any man, even trusted eunuchs she'd known her entire life, triggered violent panic responses, hyperventilation, extreme sweating, and sudden fainting. She couldn't be in the same room with her own father. Guard shifts had to be rearranged. Physicians were baffled and disturbed. They gave her condition a name: melancholia abikira, virginal melancholy, a diagnosis they claimed was common among princesses after marriage. They tried remedies, herbal tinctures, music therapy, Sufi spiritual exercises, even experimental treatments involving magnets and special diets. Nothing restored her. the brilliant child who once filled journals with astronomical observations, now left her books locked away. Her calligraphy instruments gathered dust. The gardens she'd explored with wonder became places she refused to enter. Her marriage to Kara Mustafa Pasha continued in name only. There were children, 4 in total, conceived during encounters Fatma endured in the same dissociative state that had claimed her that first night. There were public appearances where she stood silent and still as a porcelain doll. The illusion of normally was maintained for political necessity, but private memoirs from palace staff paint a darker picture. The Pasha, they claimed, began spending longer periods away on military campaigns, then turned to opium and other women, unable to face what he'd been made to do. Some accounts suggest he lobbied multiple times to be sent to the most dangerous frontiers, seeking either glory or death to escape his own guilt. Fatma lived 29 more years in this half-death. She became a ceremonial ornament, a silent figure at state functions, a womb for the empire's future political pawns. On March 15th, 1652, exactly 29 years after her wedding, she died of what physicians recorded as brain fever. But the date was too precise to be coincidence. Palace staff whispered that she'd simply decided on that anniversary that the weight of memory was finally too much to carry. Her death was marked with appropriate ceremony and then forgotten. Official chronicles barely mentioned her except as wife of Harem Mustafa Pasha, mother of 4 children, noted for her piety and obedience. The brilliant astronomer, the gifted calligrapher, the curious intellect, all erased, replaced with the empty description of a woman who fulfilled her function and disappeared. But Fatma's tragedy wasn't unique. It was the pattern. For centuries, the wedding night protocols of Ottoman princesses remained locked behind the palace's official silences. Chroniclers wrote of ceremonies and celebrations, but never what happened in those final chambers. It wasn't until 2019 that a team of researchers from Boğaziçi University's Ottoman Studies Department, led by Dr. Elif Korkmaz, gained access to restricted archives stored in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace Museum. What they found was staggering. Coded medical journals written in Persian, encrypted correspondence between harem officials, architectural blueprints of the bridal pavilions with notations about observation points and restraint systems, and detailed recipes for the sedative compounds administered to princesses. These documents had been deliberately scattered across different collections, their true nature obscured by bureaucratic categorization, hidden in plain sight for over 600 years. Dr. Korkmaz's team spent 3 years translating and cross-referencing the materials. They discovered that at least 37 Ottoman princesses between 1530 and 1826 underwent variations of the Terbiye-i protocol. Of these, 12 developed what modern psychology would classify as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. 5 attempted or completed suicide. 8 disappeared from records entirely after their wedding nights, with no official explanation for their absence from subsequent documentation. Chemical analysis of the sedative recipes revealed compounds that modern pharmacology recognizes as powerful dissociatives and anxiolytics, substances that would have induced states similar to what we now see in clinical dissociation and learned helplessness. The psychological techniques documented match patterns used in modern studies of coercive control and systematic conditioning. International reactions to the published findings ranged from shock to denial. Some Turkish nationalist historians claimed the documents were misinterpreted or exaggerated. Others argued that judging historical practices by modern standards was unfair. But trauma psychologists who reviewed the evidence unanimously agreed what was described constituted deliberate psychological torture designed to break autonomous will and create complete submission. The research sparked renewed interest in the hidden lives of royal women across other cultures. Parallel investigations uncovered similar but less systematic practices in certain European royal courts, in imperial, China's Forbidden City, and in various aristocratic traditions worldwide, all suggesting that the use of marriage as a tool of political control often came with deliberately constructed trauma as the mechanism of enforcement. The tragedy of Fatma and her sister princesses reveals an uncomfortable truth that echoes across centuries. Absolute power protects no one, not even its own children. The outside world imagined Ottoman princesses living in endless luxury, their every wish granted, their beauty celebrated, their status envied. The reality was a gilded cage where daughters were sacrificed to maintain the machinery of empire, their individual humanity crushed beneath the weight of dynastic necessity. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was cruelty as policy, trauma as strategy, systematic breaking as ritual. The Ottoman court understood something that modern psychology has only recently codified, that the most effective control isn't physical restraint, but psychological conditioning that makes the victim police themselves. That turns resistance into an impossibility their own mind won't allow. What haunts us most isn't just what happened to these young women, but how thoroughly it was hidden. The same system that destroyed them also erased their suffering from history, replacing screams with ceremonies, trauma with triumph, victims with venerated wives. For 6 centuries, the official story stood unchallenged until patient researchers pieced together fragments of truth from scattered archives. This raises questions that extend far beyond Ottoman history. How many other buried truths wait in palace archives worldwide? What rituals of power still operate today under different names, different justifications, but with the same purpose? To break will and enforce compliance. And most urgently, how many voices have been silenced in the name of tradition, authority, and political necessity that we still haven't heard? The story of Fatma is a reminder that history isn't just the tale of emperors and their conquests. It's also the echo of those silenced, the record of pain that powerful institutions